These are the key ground rules for carb cycling. We're not going to go into intricate detail. We're going to give you the high level view because carb cycling is essentially where you alternate low carb with moderate carb, but you try to time things appropriately. And I've done videos where I get into the crazy nuanced stuff, but a lot of times I lose people in the weeds because it's just too esoteric. Let's just lay out the basic foundation. So the first thing you want to focus on with carb cycling is your higher carbohydrate days should not really fall more than about 3, maybe 4 days per week. With my philosophy with carb cycling, I know other people have different opinions. Carb days are a little bit more of the anomaly. All right, you're not trying to be high carb most of the time and then periodically reduce. You're staying moderately low carb and then periodically increasing. So try to limit it to about 3, maybe 4 days per week if you're training a whole lot. The second key ground rule is that your higher carbohydrate days should land on your more anaerobic days. What does that mean? They should land on the days where you are utilizing carbohydrates as a fuel source more. That is things like resistance training, any kind of power training, any kind of sprinting, or any kind of HIIT. If you're doing aerobic work, it would not be advantageous for you to have that be a high carb day. And the reason is because your glycogen resynthesis, or your glycogen synthesis in general, would not be nearly as high. What that means is that if you're doing resistance training or sprinting, when you do have those carbohydrates, they're likely going to get sucked into the muscle belly. Whereas if you're doing aerobic work, you're more likely to just replenish your liver glycogen, and then that's about it because you're not having that demand that triggers glycogen synthesis. So resistance training days and sprinting days should be your higher carbohydrate days. Number 3, the carbohydrates you consume should come from the earth. Plain and simple. If it has a bunch of ingredients in it, it's going to be more so an ingredient-rich food than it is going to be an actual carbohydrate source for you. And what I mean by this is we want to look at things like fruits, we want to look at things like tubers, we want to look at sweet potatoes, Hawaiian sweet potatoes, we want maybe red potatoes, we want the occasional legume, we want things like that. Do not opt for the processed carbohydrates as your carb source on a higher carbohydrate day. Trust me, it will make you feel a lot worse than if you were to just have wholesome carbohydrates that are going to be satiating. The fourth ground rule is most of your carbohydrates, with the exception of the workout timed carbohydrates, which we'll talk about in a little bit, should actually be allocated a little bit more towards the evening. It sounds totally counterintuitive. As a matter of fact, it sounds like I'm almost contradicting myself since I would typically say, hey, don't eat before bed. I'm not suggesting you eat carbohydrates before bed. I'm suggesting you allocate your carbohydrates towards the latter part of the day. So maybe it's still 3 hours before bed, but you're having your carbohydrates with dinner. Maybe you're having some chicken breast with a little bit of sweet potato. Maybe you're having some white fish with some red potato. Maybe you're having some carrots and some beets and some fruit along with your salmon or something, right? You're just having your carbs more so stacked towards the evening time. Number 5, keep your typical supplement regime. I don't suggest you change a lot at all, but on your carbohydrate days, you may want to add a little bit of chromium or even cinnamon capsules because it can help you utilize those carbohydrates a little bit better, and it might help you prevent that like glucose intolerance that would cause your glucose to spike a whole lot outside of the realm that you want it. Secondly, creatine. Now, creatine, I would recommend increasing the dose a tiny bit on your lower carb days, and then maybe decreasing the dose a tiny bit on your higher carb days. That's not as big of a deal as just taking creatine in the first place. I think creatine during a carb cycling approach helps you maintain that intracellular water volume, that muscle volume that may otherwise fluctuate with rising and falling glycogen stores, because your carbohydrates are stored in your muscles. When you burn them up, those deplete and then you rebuild them. So to avoid sort of this Alice in Wonderland effect of getting bigger and smaller, the scale going up and down, I found that 3 to 5 grams of creatine daily keeps my muscle volume a lot more stable and my weight stable, even if I am cycling carbohydrates. Now, I also like to take my creatine throughout the day. Like I'll take 1 gram, 2 grams, 3 grams, and I'll space them out throughout the day. And that reduces the water retention a little bit more. I put a link down below for 20% off of the Create gummies. These are the creatine gummies that I use. They're 1 gram creatine monohydrate gummies. Now, the entire point behind Create was to sort of get rid of the stigma behind creatine in the first place. It's not just for building muscle. There's literature surrounding fat loss. There's literature surrounding brain performance. There's literature surrounding inflammation. There's a lot of data out there, and it's probably one of the most, if not the most, studied ergogenic aid that's out there. So no matter what your goal is, I can assure you there's an application for it. So that link down below is for 20% off the Create gummies. That link is in the top line of the description. Again, 20% off a bag of those gummies or however much you want. And the best thing about them is you can adjust your dose accordingly with like 1 gram in the morning, 1 gram with lunch, 1 gram with dinner, maybe more. You can go all the way up to 10, 15 grams, whatever you really choose to do, and you can titrate that dose accordingly. So again, big thank you to Create, and that link is in the top line of the description. Ground rule number 6 is electrolytes should be used, particularly on your lower carb days. Now, you don't have to go and spend a bunch of money on electrolyte. Do whatever you want. Add a little bit of salt to your water if you really want to. But I would suggest an electrolyte. And the reason is because you are going high carb, low carb, or even in the case, moderate carb, low carb. What's happening is you're decreasing your insulin levels as you decrease those carbohydrates. Lower insulin levels equals more water being excreted, which also means more minerals and trace minerals being excreted. And this constant fluctuation can sometimes be hard on mineral balance in the body because you're trying to find homeostasis all the time. So anecdotally, I've found that if I increase my electrolyte intake on my lower carb days and decrease it on my higher carb days when I have enough fluid retention as is, I end up feeling a lot more even keeled and I don't feel depleted. Number 7 is a ground rule that is very important. However, it is a little bit anecdotal because the research is really only solid in rodent model stuff. So I can't say, hey, pure evidence, do this. But I like to keep my fat intake a little bit lower, quite a bit lower actually, on my carbohydrate day. Now, Charles Poliquin talked about this for years. He was of the belief that when you take in carbohydrates and fats at the same time, there's a metabolic inefficiency that occurs where the body's like trying to utilize one fuel or the other, but you're bombarding it with both. And it doesn't really know what to burn and what to store. Now, arguably our gene expression and all this is intelligent enough to understand what fuel is what. But at the same time, it makes a lot of sense. But additionally, when you're eating more carbohydrates, there's a good chance that your appetite's going to increase. And if you're adding fats along with those carbohydrates, the propensity to overeat is significantly higher. And that's the biggest blanket thing that I can say with almost certainty, that if you add a bunch of fats and carbs in one day, you're going to light up your brain like a Christmas tree and you're going to want to eat more. So increase those carbohydrates, but appropriately decrease your fats. For me, on a day that I add maybe 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrates, I'll decrease my fat intake by 50, 60 grams. That's for me personally. Ground rule number 8. Now this can vary depending on your training intensity, depending on your experience, but I aim for 0.75 to 1 gram of carbohydrate per pound of fat-free mass, or I guess in this case, lean body mass, my muscle mass rather. Now, the way that I figure this is through a DEXA scan, but I don't expect you to do that. If you have a rough idea of what your body fat percentage is, you could do the math. But what I would typically say is, well, take your body weight and subtract maybe 20% or so, and aim for that as your carbohydrate goal. So let's say, for example, I'm 200 pounds. I'm going to take 20% of that off. That puts me at 160. 160 grams would be the high end of my carbohydrate range. I am in no way, shape, or form trying to tell you exactly how much carbohydrate you should consume. Everybody is different. But that tends to be a good number for people that are going up and down with carbohydrate intake. If you start adding a whole bunch in, you start getting into that cheat meal territory where you may not feel real good, right? If you go 40, 50 grams of carbs, 60 grams of carbs normally, and then skyrocket up to 400, that's a lot on your body, and you might feel like you inflame and gain a lot of water weight, which just may not have a huge long-term problem for you, but it's probably uncomfortable. Number 9 kind of goes without saying. The foods that you should choose for your carbohydrates should be as antioxidant rich as possible. Now, this is just good food for thought no matter what you're doing. Choose foods that are rich in polyphenols. Sweet potatoes with anthocyanins, blueberries with anthocyanins, things that have quercetin in them. Look for antioxidant-rich foods. There's something called the ORAC score, or ORAC. Now, this is the oxygen-reducing antioxidant capacity score. If you go on Google and you just type in foods high in ORAC score, that's going to give you a list of foods that have the highest antioxidant capabilities. I'm going to spare you the time here and not really go into it because you can do a simple Google search for that. Number 10. I add more fiber on my lower carb days, and this is simply because on my higher carb days, I'm naturally getting more fiber in. But if you're not paying attention, when you reduce your carbohydrate intake, you might find that your fiber intake goes down. So make a little bit more of a concerted effort to add more fiber via flax, via psyllium, whatever, on your lower carb days. Number 11 is one that you can definitely mess around with. This is going to be, if you want extra carbohydrates, add them in intra-workout. Here's the reason. Two reasons, actually. For one, you can enjoy carbohydrates without the insulin spike because of the glucose or insulin-independent glucose uptake, where carbohydrates go into your muscles without insulin simply because you're moving your body and the uptake is easy. Secondly, it allows you to get those carbohydrates into the muscle better, which is good for another reason, because then you're restoring muscle glycogen so that the days that your carbohydrates are lower, you don't feel depleted because the carbs have gone to the right spot and you have enough glycogen to allow yourself to perform in a workout despite not eating carbohydrates just prior or even a day prior. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.